I want to look at a subject this morning. I want to talk about sin. And there are three things that I want to bring out, and I believe that they're important points. And we really are going to spend a good deal of our time in talking about the prodigal son, but not in the same fashion that you normally have studied it. You know, when you look at sin, sin has some repercussions. And that's basically what we're going to be discussing over the next few minutes. Sin will take you where you don't want to go. And I think one of the problems that people sometimes have is they look at sin and view it too lightly, and they don't recognize the dangers of it. And they don't realize that in so many cases that sin is something that is not static, that it is something that tends to move us, and it will take us where we don't want to go. The second thing is that sin will keep you longer than you want to stay. Then once you go somewhere, you may think of this as just being a brief visit, just a quick in and out, and I no longer will be there. But the truth is that that's just not so. That's not the nature of sin. And the third thing we want to look at is that sin will cost you more than you want to pay. Now, we're going to look at these three things and consider them. And we're going to look at them particularly as it relates to the prodigal son. Now, I realize that this is a very familiar passage. It is probably one of the top 10 most familiar passages in the New Testament. And that there are probably very few people, unless they're totally unenlightened and uneducated people, that haven't heard the expression, the prodigal son. I want to read what's stated by Jesus in Luke 15, verse 11. A certain man had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falleth to me, and he divided them unto them his living. Not many days after, the younger son gathered all together and took his journey into a far country. There wasted his substance with riotous living. And when he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in that land, and he began to be in want. And he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into the fields to feed swine. And he would fain have filled his belly with the husks that the swine did eat, and no man gave unto him. And when he came to himself, he said, How many hired servants of my father's have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before thee. I am no more worthy to be called thy son. Make me as one of thy hired servants. And he arose and came to his father, but when he was yet a great way off, his father saw him, had compassion, and ran, and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in thy sight, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. And the father said to his servants, Bring forth the best robe, put it on him, put a ring on his hand, and shoes on his feet. And bring hither the fatted calf, and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found, and they began to be merry. Now his elder son was in the field. And as he came and drew nigh to the house, he heard music and dancing, and he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said unto him, Thy brother is come, and thy father hath killed the fatted calf, because he hath received him safe and sound. And he was angry, and would not go in. Therefore came his father out and entreated him, and he answering said to his father, Lo, these many years do I serve thee. Neither transgressed I at any time thy commandment, and yet you never gavest me a kid, that I might make merry with my friends. But as soon as this thy son was come, which hath devoured thy living with harlots, thou hast killed for him the fatted calf. And he said unto him, Son, thou art ever with me, and all that I have is thine. It was meet that we should make merry and be glad, for this thy brother was dead and is alive, and was lost and is found. Now we said that quite often sin will take you where you don't want to go. Let's give some consideration to this parable, and let's just think about where sin carried him. You know, if you look at where he was, if you look at the prodigal son, where was he? Well, he lived in an affluent family. Evidently had a good, strong, supportive family, all the comfort and security that brought him. And this is what he had. But then, when we look at where he ended up, well, he ended up in a hog pen, eating with the hogs. That's where he ended up. Now, I'm pretty certain that when he was contemplating the move that he was going to make, that was not what he intended to happen. That was not what he expected to happen. And I'm pretty certain that he had a much picture of how things would turn out than how they did turn out. Well, let's take a moment. Is this where he wanted to be? Did he want to be there? When he was in the hog pen and he's sitting down and he's as a Jewish person associated with hogs, which you couldn't even touch them without becoming unclean, and not only was he associated with them, he was actually with them and he was eating the same food they were eating. You think that's really where he wanted to be? Well, obviously not. That wasn't where he wanted to be. You know, one of the things you learn from this is that decisions have to be made with a lot of thought. That we have to be really careful when we're making up our minds about things. Just think for a moment. I don't know if you've ever had occasion to do any investment or not, but if you have, one of the common kinds of investments would be mutual funds. And if you're investing in a mutual fund, they give you what's called a prospectus. And it's intended for you to have all the information before you so that when you make a decision that you know what that decision is and you understand it well. And you're going to be able to live with the consequence of that decision, whatever the consequences might be. Well, I suspect that when this young man was sitting down and looking at this decision that he was going to make, that he didn't consider any of those things. In fact, I think sometimes it is one of the decisions, one of the problems that man has. One of the most popular passages in today's world is Joshua 24, verse 15. And the popular part of that verse is that as for me and choose you this day whom you will serve, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Those are the two parts of it that we commonly look at. Think about what a momentous decision that was. And think about if you're a person that's making a decision and you decide on the other side of that, what a momentous decision that would be. If you go back a bit from the days that Joshua made this statement right near the end of his life. But 40 years earlier, 40 years before this date, this was not a decision that he just made lightly. 40 years earlier, he had been called upon to make a decision. He was one of the spies, went into the land to give the advice whether we should go or whether we should not. He came back and said we should go. Now, there were 10 spies that came back with a different decision. Whom will you serve? Well, we'll serve our physical best interest as we view it, and that is don't go into the land. When Joshua made this statement in chapter 24, how many of those people who had made that decision to go in the other direction were living? None. In fact, when they went into the land, none of them were living. All of them died in the wilderness during the 40-year wandering. I mean, it makes you to understand where sin will take you. Sin took those 10 spies to an early grave and a forfeiture of a promise that they looked forward to all their lives. That's a pretty big thing, is it not? Well, let's think about this. When the young man was leaving, do you think he thought that he would go off and he would just... is this necessarily to say, well, I'm going to just move my residence? That I'm not going to be here with my family anymore. I'm done with this. I don't know that he necessarily made that decision. I know that he didn't make the decision to stay there during some of the circumstances that he endured. I know that for a fact. There's no sane person that would have wanted to do what he did and would have stayed there that long unless forced to. You know what he probably thought? I know I'm putting words in his mouth, but these and words in the text in a sense. But I'm just thinking with you a few moments. Think of all the people that you know. Quite often people say, "Well, I'm just going to sow a few wild oats and then I'll move on." There are a lot of young people that think that. Experimenting with drugs is something that comes out of that. People say, "Well, you know, I'm just going to smoke a little marijuana. No big deal." Next thing you know, they're a meth addict. Next thing you know, they're dead. I mean, we don't sometimes stop to think of how long we can stay in something. Do we intend it just to be something to have a big time, and the first thing you know is taking control of our lives? Now, let's think about it. I'm going to go back to another occasion that's also very familiar. In his decision-making process, I doubt if it ever occurred to him that sin is a great deal like a spider web. You ever sit on a front porch or a back porch or any porch? And you're sitting there in your rocking chair or your easy chair and you're looking, and you see a poor old bug gets into a spider web, or a fly. Fly, pretty common. And he gets into the spider web, and what does he begin to do? Well, he wants out. That's what he wants. And so he's doing everything he can, and he's kicking and he's pushing and shoving and trying to get out. But what you notice, if you're sitting there watching him, is every time that he does that, every movement he makes, he actually becomes more entangled. And so after a period of time, he finally just gives up because he's sitting there completely encased and he can't move, and so he just really can do nothing. When you look back to David in 2 Samuel, I'm not going to read all this because everybody remembers the story. It's too common. He's sitting there up on his roof. He's walking on his roof, and he views a woman, and she's washing herself, and she's beautiful to look upon, and so he sends to fetch her, and I'm pretty certain what his idea was. Pretty certain what his idea was. I'm going to have a fling with this woman, and then tomorrow I'll forget the whole thing, and no problem will come of it. It'll just be just a part of life, just having a big time, sowing, if you please, some wild oats, just enjoying yourself. And so he does that. And then he begins the process when he discovers that she is in fact expecting a child, and her husband hadn't been home for a long, long period of time, and this is going to be hard to cover up, and he begins to try to cover it up. Takes several steps to do that. The final step he was to murder her husband. Now, some people say that that's not true, but if you read what God said in the 13th chapter, that's exactly what God said. He killed him. Now, he didn't physically himself do it, but he, by his actions, secured his death. I'll guarantee you that if David were in a court of law in the United States today, with the circumstances that happened there, he'd be convicted of murder. No question. Now, do you think that when David is standing upon his roof and he looks at this beautiful woman and he brings her to his house, commits fornication, and then sends her home, he probably thought the whole thing was over? That's not the way sin is. Sin is something that's much different than that. Sin is something that has a tendency to hold on to us and to keep us in it. And the first thing you know, we find that we're having a hard time getting out. We kind of like that poor old bug in the spider web. We struggle and we struggle, and we just continue to become deeper and deeper in our involvement. How many times that happen? Well, it's pretty common. Think about this. If you commit a sin, whatever it is, it doesn't make a difference what sin it is. If you commit a sin, how can it be dealt with effectively? Well, in the 13th chapter of the book of Luke, Jesus said this in verse 1. He talked about some people, said there were present at that season some that told him of the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. Seems to be talking about a rebellious group who were rebelling against Rome, and they were offering sacrifice in their effort. And Jesus answering said unto them, Suppose ye that those Galileans were sinners above all the Galileans because they suffered such things? He said, I tell you, nay, but except you repent, you shall all likewise perish. Just think about it for a moment. what would be the only out? Let's just suppose that David took a different approach to this. Just think about it for a moment. Suppose that David, having committed fornication or adultery with Bathsheba and realized the great mistake that he had made, had sent to the battlefield by Joab and said, send Uriah back, and brought him to his house and told him, said, I'm going to tell you what happened. I've asked God's forgiveness. He's forgiven me. I'm asking you to forgive me. Now, he might not have forgiven him. I don't know. But I know one thing. He would have never had to worry about that event again from the standpoint of all the things that transpired. What people sometimes don't realize, and if you go back and study the Old Testament in detail, and you look at the relationship that Joab had with David, and you look at all the things that Joab did in violation of the orders that David gave, and David never took any steps against him, I don't believe there's any question, as we sometimes say, Joab had something on David and he did what he pleased, and David couldn't oppose him. Only way he could have ever solved that is to repent and just made a complete break and change. Let me tell you something. Sin has a tendency to keep us. Satan, in fact, how many people have you talked with who've been involved in some long-running sinful activity who are always telling you two things? I could quit if I want to, and so one day I will. Those two things you hear pretty common. I can quit anytime I want to, and someday I will. How many times do they ever actually do it? That is, to quit. Not very often. As long as you keep thinking, I can just be involved in it, I can just keep on, and sin just keeps wrapping you up tighter and tighter and tighter. So how long do you stay? The person who becomes involved in things has a hard time. If he doesn't repent and make a clean break, he stays till he dies. And then he has eternity to regret it. So you have to stop and think. Sin, it'll take you where you don't want to go, and it'll keep you longer than you want to stay. But then, what does it cost? If you stop and you think a moment, young people are prone to make a statement more than older people. Older people have usually learned better. Sometimes don't act better, but they at least don't. They realize that, hey, I'm probably going to have a rough road here. But young people sometimes have a tendency to make this statement that, what could it hurt just have a little fun? I can just see this guy. When his father's trying to tell him all the pitfalls and the dangers and what can happen. And he said, you're just an old man, you don't understand. What could it possibly hurt for me just to have a little fun? What's going to be the problem? It seemed that this young man did not understand that actions have consequences. It's a problem that we still have. News stories that suggest to me that people don't know that actions have consequences, that you get involved in something bad and the outcome is usually not going to be good. In Galatians chapter 6, he said, be not deceived, God is not mocked. Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. For he that soweth of his flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption, but he that soweth the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. Let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not. That's a true statement. You can't plant Johnson grass seed and get corn. It won't happen. And you can't plant a riotous, unruly life and expect any peace of mind. It's not going to happen. Now let's think for a moment about something. I want you to think of the end result. I want you to think of the cost that's involved in this idea that he had. Now, everybody in here is in one of two states. You either were young once or you are young now. One of the two. So you're going to understand what I'm going to say. How many of you have said, I just don't see what the harm is because it's not a big deal? And probably most of us at some point, in modern times at least, have made that argument to their parents. I will be honest. People always say, well, you probably said that to your daddy. No. Because if I had, I'd probably pick myself up off the floor when it was all done. So that kind of statement and that kind of back talk between my dad didn't happen. But the thing is, I do understand that I said it to other people. What can it hurt? Just have a little fun. It's just no big deal. Let's ask a question. What did it hurt? I mean, what was the price that was paid when this was done? When he had gotten his money, he had gone to a far country, and he'd had his fun, and then he comes back home. Let's think about where he was. Remember where he was in the beginning? He was in a comfortable home, plenty to eat. Everything was great. Support from his family, a relationship with his brother, all the things that you treasure. That's what he had to begin with. Now let's look at it when he got through. Let's look at the end. Number one, he lost his wealth. Lost everything he had. I mean, how do I know that? Because it said he wasted his substance with riotous living, and when he had spent all. Now, I understand the word all, don't you? If he took $10,000 with him, he had none when it was over. So he spent $10,000 on this just having a little fun, if that's the amount he took. Whatever it was, I don't know. But I do understand the concept of all. When the dust settled in this situation, what was intended to just have a little fun ends up you're dead broke, 100%. And you're reduced to homelessness and begging. And that's where you are. And what got you there? Sin. I mean, it didn't look like much in the beginning. It looked like no big deal. But his wealth was gone. Second thing, his dignity. Have you ever thought about if you were a homeless person in Nashville? Just think of yourself, how you feel if you get in a situation where you just cannot handle something. Let's just suppose that you got in such bad shape, one of you in this audience, that you couldn't pay your electric bill, and you had to come over to Larry and say, Larry, could you possibly let me have $125 to pay my electric bill? How bad that would hurt you? Well, think of a person who's reduced themselves down to the point that they just stand there with a sign and they want money to support their habits, whatever they might be, whether it's eating and sleeping or whether it's drugs and beer. I don't know, whatever it is. But think of when you look at that person and you realize that sin has just taken away their dignity. They don't have any. They gave it up. And if you talk with them, you see interviews with persons in that type of a situation, they don't really hide that. They really don't feel. In fact, one thing they really want is they want to feel a sense of self-worth because they don't have it. They want you to have it, but they don't have it. It's been removed from them. And I don't know how long he was gone. I don't know. But he didn't leave his father on very good terms. He walked out the door basically saying, you're just a silly old man. You just don't understand. Now, he didn't maybe say it, but that's what his actions were saying. And he pulled himself away, and he had no relationship with his father for whatever period of time that he was gone. You know what's interesting? You know, when I was a young fellow, my father and I weren't the closest in the world, but when I got to be older, we were very close. He was the best man at my wedding. I considered him to be one of my closest friends. And he's been dead now 20-something years, and, you know, it'd be great to have a day to go over and sit down and have a meal with him. That's not going to happen. But that's not anything except normal behavior. But at one point in my life, I did kind of have a falling out with him, and I didn't speak to him, and he didn't speak to me for an extended period of time. And that's unfortunate because that can't be gained back. You've lost something, and it's because of sinful behavior. In this case, he committed sin, and it separated him as his father, and he didn't have that relationship with him. And when all was said and done, let me ask you a question. From what you read in this passage, in this 16th chapter, or 15th chapter, I'm sorry, wrong chapter. in this 15th chapter, when all is said and done, what's the last thing you see that his brother did? Now, I know his father went out and talked to him. I know he did. And he entreated him. And I know what the answer was his brother gave. And that's the end of the conversation in verse 31. Or rather, verse 32. Excuse me, verse 31, the end of his conversation. He said unto him, son, verse 30 is the last word the brother said. Verse 31 and 32, the last things the father said, but we don't see the response of the brother. I don't know what his response was to his father's pleading. But I know what I have seen in life. I have seen people in life who've ended up losing their relationship with their family over sinful behavior, and it's never restored. I know that happens. Now, you think about it. What did he lose? What did he not lose? That's the question. You know, here's the thing. When Jesus said, if you're going to be my disciple, in fact, it's right in the chapter that precedes this one. If you're going to be my disciple, you're going to have to take up your cross and follow me. And that means you've got to be all in, 100%. You've got to make a decision. The only thing that's important in my life is serving God through His Son, Jesus Christ. And that's what's important. But that's a willing decision. You make that decision. But here's the problem. Sin is not satisfied until it takes everything you have. And that's not a willing decision. That's not what you want to happen, but that's what happens in too many cases. What's the cost? Well, kind of hard to determine. Maybe different in different people's lives. But one thing I know is the cost. You'll lose your soul in eternity. But the last point I want to make is this. When you think about all the things that he lost, I often talk about the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul is a person that, you know, you're talking about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and being two different people but in the same body. Had two different names, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The Apostle Paul was kind of like that. The Apostle Paul, Saul of Tarsus. Two different people. Two different people entirely. But before he was the Apostle Paul, he was Saul of Tarsus. And as Saul of Tarsus, he was a horrible human being. No doubt. He was involved in killing people because of their faith. He was involved in putting people in prison because of their faith. And he meets with Jesus on the road to Damascus. He's converted. He becomes Paul the Apostle. And now he has a problem. You know, you stop and think. If you have a past, as they say, a lot of people have a past. A lot of people you know have a past. But you don't know anything about it. You don't know anything about their past. And so, you don't have a problem with them. You look at them and what you see is what they are. You don't see what they were. But there is a problem with that. What about the person who has a past? In a sense, I think I've kind of had a past. And I look back on it, a lot of things I'm not very proud of. You don't know anything about those things. You didn't know me. Unless I happen to tell you about them, you don't know them. And even then, you kind of think, oh, that's just like fiction. You know, you just read it and you don't pay much attention to it because you know what I am now. And I hope that's a pretty good fellow. But what about me? Do I ever reach a point where my past doesn't have any effect on me? You know yourself. When the Apostle Paul, in 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 15, was writing to Timothy and said, "This is a faithful saying and worthy of all acceptation, that Jesus Christ came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am chief. So let me ask you a question. Do you think the Apostle Paul ever got to the point in his entire life, up to the point of his death, where he didn't sometimes stop and think? One of the things I often think about, have you ever seen a depiction of a stoning to death? Of someone being stoned to death? And not a very pretty picture. I've seen movies about it, and in fact, I've seen some newscasts where people were trying to stone folks to death, and it's not a very pretty picture. People throwing rocks at people until they expire, until one just happens to hit the right place to kill them. So you stop and you think about that. The Apostle Paul was there, agreeing to, encouraging, egging on, and holding the clothes of the persons who stoned Stephen to death. And he was standing there watching it. So you're telling me that even at the time of his death, that he had finally got to the point he never thought of that again. He never considered that. That it never crossed his mind. If there's anything in your past that was particularly egregious, surely not like that, but was particularly egregious, I suspect that there are occasions that you think about it and you think, boy, why? Why? One thing that never returns when we commit sin is the total respect for ourselves, because we see the mistake that we made. And there's no excusing it. There's no denying it. It's there. Now, everyone else may go on as if it never happened. Everyone else may even forget it. They may forget all about it, and it may never cross their mind at all. But I would almost guarantee you that not you. Paul said, you know what? Till I die, I remember those things. So think about it. Sin. You know, everybody looks at sin and we tend to laugh, make jokes. I mean, Flip Wilson used to make a living running around saying the devil made me do it, and everybody just laugh and laugh. And we look at sin, we make jokes about it. What we need to sometimes realize is this. Sin's not a laughing matter. It'll take you where you don't want to go. It'll keep you longer than you want to stay. And in the end, it'll cost whatever you'll give it. We're going to sing a song of encouragement. If you're not a Christian, not a child of God, only one thing you can do with sin that takes care of it, and that is repent, be baptized for remission of sins, have your sins washed away. Now, do they stop being in your mind? No. You see that in the Apostle Paul. If as a Christian we sin, the only way we can handle that is just to repent and stop. But there is an old saying that something is easier said than done. And it's pretty easy to see, looking at this lesson, that this is one of them. Sin's a tough customer. Tough customer. The toughest battle that you'll ever have. And you need to stop and think about sin in a more negative light and realize the consequence of it. We're going to sing a song of encouragement. If you need to respond to it, we can certainly encourage you to do so as together we stand.